For 3,000 years, no soldier went to war without a shield. Then, suddenly, within a century, shields vanished from European battlefields. Ask any historian and they'll tell you firearms made shields obsolete. Bullets penetrated wood and metal, so shields became useless. That explanation sounds logical. It's also completely wrong. Firearms existed for over 200 years before shields disappeared. The real reason is more brutal and reveals something disturbing about how warfare actually evolves. The shield's 3,000-year reign. Shields dominated ancient warfare for a simple reason. They worked. A round shield weighing 10 to 15 pounds could stop arrows, deflect sword cuts, and block spear thrusts. The shield was your primary defensive tool. Your weapon was secondary. Bronze Age warriors used shields because their swords couldn't parry. Bronze blades deformed on impact, so blocking with your weapon would destroy it. The shield did all defensive work. Roman legionaries conquered the Mediterranean behind their scutum shields. The rectangular curved design protected the entire body while allowing tight formation fighting. The gladius sword was deadly, but the shield made Roman infantry unstoppable. Medieval knights carried kite shields, then heater shields, adapting the design as armor improved. Viking warriors formed shield walls that could hold against cavalry charges. Byzantine infantry used large oval shields that overlapped to create mobile fortifications. For 3 millennia, across every culture, the shield was essential. Then, between roughly 1550 and 1650, it disappeared. What changed? The firearm myth. The standard explanation is simple. Firearms penetrated shields, making them useless. But look at the actual timeline, and this falls apart immediately. Hand cannons appeared in Europe around 1350. Arquebuses became common by 1450. Matchlock muskets were standard infantry weapons by 1500. Yet shields remained in widespread use until after 1600. That's 250 years where firearms and shields coexisted on the same battlefields. If guns made shields obsolete, why did it take 2.5 centuries for anyone to notice? Testing reveals why. A 16th century arquebus firing at 50 meters could penetrate a wooden shield, but it couldn't reliably penetrate a shield and the armor behind it. The shield still reduced the effective range of firearms significantly. More importantly, early firearms were slow. An arquebus took 30 to 60 seconds to reload. A trained archer could lose 10 to 12 arrows in that time. For most of the 16th century, battlefields still had more archers and crossbowmen than gunners. Against those weapons, shields remained highly effective. So firearms didn't kill the shield. Something else did. And that something changed warfare more fundamentally than gunpowder ever could. The real killer. Pike formations. The Swiss pike square revolutionized European warfare in the late 1400s. Massive formations of pikemen, 20 to 30 ranks deep, wielding 18 to 20-foot pikes. These formations were nearly invincible against cavalry and could roll over traditional infantry. Here's what matters. You cannot carry a shield and effectively wield an 18-foot pike. The physics don't work. The pike requires 2 hands. You need one hand near the butt for leverage and one hand further up the shaft for control. Add a shield and you can't manipulate the weapon. Swiss and German Landsknecht pike formations dominated battlefields from 1480 to 1550. Other nations had to adapt or die. That meant adopting pike tactics, and pike tactics meant abandoning shields. But pikes alone didn't kill the shield. Plenty of armies used mixed formations with pikemen in the center and other troops on the flanks. Those flank troops could have kept their shields. They didn't. Why? The armor revolution. Between 1450 and 1550, plate armor reached its peak. Full suits of articulated steel plate that covered the entire body. This armor could stop arrows, deflect sword cuts, and even resist early firearms at range. A fully armored man-at-arms didn't need a shield. The armor was the shield. Carrying an additional 10 to 15 pounds of wood and metal was just dead weight that slowed you down and tired you out. But full plate armor was expensive. Only wealthy knights and professional soldiers could afford it. Common infantry still wore minimal armor, maybe a helmet and a padded jacket. They still needed shields, right? Wrong. Because the tactical revolution that made pikes dominant also changed what common infantry did on the battlefield. The tactical shift. Medieval infantry fought in relatively loose formations. Individual combat skills mattered. You needed space to use your weapon and your shield. Battles were thousands of individual fights happening simultaneously. Pike square tactics were completely different. The formation was the weapon. Individual skill mattered far less than maintaining formation integrity. You stood shoulder to shoulder with the men beside you, pike leveled, moving as a single mass. In this system, shields were worse than useless. They took up space. They disrupted formation formation cohesion. They tired men out during long marches, and they provided minimal benefit because the formation itself was the defense. If an enemy broke through to close combat, the pikemen dropped their pikes and drew swords. But this was already a disaster scenario. The formation had failed. Whether you had a shield at that point didn't matter. You were probably dead anyway. Other infantry adapted to support pike formations. Arquebusiers and musketeers provided ranged fire. Halberdiers and two-handed sword fighters protected the flanks and broke up enemy formations. None of these roles benefited from shields. The two-handed sword fighters, called Doppelsoldner in German armies, specifically used massive swords to cut the heads off enemy pikes. You can't do that while carrying a shield. The tactical role required both hands free. The economic reality. Here's what nobody talks about. Shields were expensive to maintain. A wooden shield took damage in every battle. Arrows embedded in it, sword cuts split the wood. The shield facing, whether leather or metal, needed constant repair. After a major battle, armies had to repair or replace hundreds of damaged shields. This required craftsmen, materials, and time. For a 16th century army of 10,000 men, maintaining shields for even half the force was a massive logistical burden. Compare that to pike formations. A pike was a long wooden shaft with a metal point. Damage was usually limited to the point, which was easy to replace. The shaft could last for years. The maintenance burden was far lower. When military effectiveness was roughly equal, the cheaper option won. Pike formations without shields were more cost-effective than traditional infantry with shields. Governments and commanders made economic decisions, not romantic ones. If you're learning that military history is about logistics and economics more than heroism, subscribe now. The gunpowder tipping point. Firearms didn't make shields obsolete, but they did make the final decision easier. By 1600, firearms had improved significantly. Matchlock muskets were more reliable, more powerful, and more common. The ratio of gunners to pikemen in armies increased steadily. A shield that could stop arrows struggled against musket balls. The added weight provided diminishing returns, and since pike tactics had already pushed shields out of most infantry roles, removing them entirely made sense. But even then, shields didn't disappear overnight. Some cavalry units used shields into the 1600s. Scottish Highlanders used targes, small round shields, into the 1700s. These were specialized uses where the tactical situation still favored shields. The shield disappeared not because it stopped working, but because the entire tactical system that made it necessary had been replaced. The cavalry exception. Cavalry kept shields longer than infantry, but even they eventually abandoned them. Heavy cavalry in full-plate armor didn't need shields. Light cavalry found shields interfered with their primary weapons, sabers and pistols. The Polish Hussars, one of the most effective cavalry forces of the 1600s, didn't use shields. They wore partial armor and relied on speed, shock impact, and long lances. Adding shields would have reduced their mobility, their primary advantage. By 1650, virtually no European cavalry used shields in battle. The tactical roles that cavalry filled, shock charges and pursuit, didn't benefit from the added weight and reduced weapon flexibility. What this actually reveals. The shield's disappearance reveals how military technology actually evolves. We want to believe that better technology replaces worse technology, that superior weapons drive out inferior ones through obvious advantage. But that's not what happened. Shields didn't stop working. They remained effective at their design purpose, stopping arrows and deflecting cuts. They disappeared because the tactical system changed. Pike formations required two-handed weapons. Improved armor reduced the need for shields among wealthy troops. Economic pressures favored cheaper equipment. Firearms provided a convenient excuse to finalize a decision that had already been made for other reasons. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Longbows didn't disappear because firearms were better. Early firearms were worse in almost every way. Longbows disappeared because training an archer took years, while training a musketeer took weeks. The economic and logistical advantages mattered more than battlefield performance. Cavalry didn't disappear because of machine guns. Cavalry charges were already obsolete due to rifled firearms and artillery. Machine guns just made the existing reality undeniable. The uncomfortable truth. Military equipment doesn't disappear because it stops working. It disappears because the system that made it necessary changes. Those changes are driven by economics, logistics, and tactical evolution, not by dramatic technological breakthroughs. The shield protected soldiers for 3,000 years. It still worked in 1600, but warfare had evolved past the point where that protection was worth the cost. Soldiers didn't become braver or tougher. The tactical roles they filled simply didn't benefit from carrying shields anymore. This is the uncomfortable truth about military history. Decisions that get thousands of soldiers killed aren't made based on what protects them best. They're made based on what wins battles most cost-effectively. The shield disappeared because armies could win without it. Whether individual soldiers would have preferred to keep their shields didn't matter. That's not the heroic story we want to hear, but it's the truth. And understanding that truth reveals more about how warfare actually works than any myth about firearms making shields obsolete ever could.